With 8 games over 11 years, it's hard not to be burnt out on Assassin's Creed. Last year's addition to the franchise, Assassin's Creed Origins, provided an RPG-flavoured breath of fresh air for Ubisoft's flagship series, but it wasn't without numerous missteps. When Assassin's Creed Odyssey debuted looking so similar to Origins at first glance, I had high hopes. Maybe the aspects that frustrated me about Origins would be polished up. Maybe Assassin's Creed Odyssey would be the new high point for the series. In short, boy was I wrong. Bafflingly, Assassin's Creed Odyssey takes place before the game in the series that uses Origins as its subtitle, and puts players in control of either Alexios or Cassandra, an ex-Spartan whose tragic past leads them into a tangled web of conspiracy and war. The game's plot is surprising in that it doesn't really fall back into the series' usual tropes until a third of the way through, instead choosing to focus on the hero's traumatic history and their life as a mercenary. But don't worry, the game manages to pack a whole lot of crazy in, despite not diving into it as soon as possible. Ubisoft take a lot of liberties with historical accuracy this time around, and on the one hand it's refreshing and unpredictable. On the other, Odyssey's most ridiculous moments feel incredibly out of place, and in the end it sort of overshadows the personal drama of the main character, which I'd argue is the most engaging part of the game. What makes Alexios and Cassandra compelling, beyond their tragic backstory, is the fact that for the first time in an Assassin's Creed game you have more control over their personality, thanks to the inclusion of multiple dialogue options. While this allows for your character to feel how you want them to, the choices the game presents you with often feel meaningless. You can try to avoid the occasional combat scenario or choose to romance various characters, but at the end of the day, very few choices you make in the game actually seem to have any larger ramifications. Thankfully, the dialogue is, for the most part, well written and brought to life by some solid voice work, as well as some super awkward animation. Ubisoft manages to steer clear of any particularly over-the-top stereotypical Greek accents, for the most part, and the two leads are of particular note. Cassandra's voice work is probably the strongest in the game. She's played sort of confident but rough around the edges, whereas Alexios is bombastic and cheesy as hell from what I've seen. While both certainly have their ups and downs, if I had to recommend who to play as, my vote would be for Cassandra. Alexios is just a little too much for me to deal with for the entire playthrough. Speaking of being just a little too much, the world Ubisoft has brought to life in Odyssey is overwhelmingly large. The Greek world certainly looks spectacular, from the muddy villages of Kefalonia to the wonders of Athens, and while I appreciate the effort made to recreate these historic locations as one gigantic open world, I can't help but feel like it's lacking something. For all its size, not a whole lot sets one area of the world apart from another. Sure, each location in Odyssey has different details, but at a glance I couldn't tell you which city is which. The game as a whole lacks any distinct visual personality. It looks good, but that's kind of all it does. Odyssey's massive world is also a hindrance in terms of gameplay. Despite being littered with countless forts to clear, animals to hunt, viewpoints to sync, and other random busy work to do, Ubisoft's rendition of the Greek world ultimately feels devoid of worthwhile content. Even the side missions with their own narratives feel like a waste of time, as very few of them relate back to the core story in any meaningful way. The ones that do are great, but they're so few and far between that I found myself burning out on the game's side content before too long. This is made worse by the fact that even some of the main story quests delve into the game's nebulous busywork, and a lot of AC Odyssey's story is gated off behind level difficulty, forcing you to grind way more than I found enjoyable. Speaking of grinding, Assassin's Creed Odyssey suffers from a leveling system that feels like it was included to artificially raise the difficulty, pad out the game length, and sell microtransactions. Coming up against enemies even a single level above you can be rough, especially if they're elite soldiers, and trying to assassinate an elite, even one that's on your level, can prove to be impossible, at least in one shot. I suppose the upside to this leveling system is that you get access to special attacks and skills as you level up, but I found that most of these skills were only useful in trying to mitigate the bullshit that comes with level locked difficulty, and no matter how cool certain skills are, it doesn't make up for the time wasted grinding to reach a recommended level for the story, or gathering materials to upgrade your better armor sets. This was a problem in Origins as well, but unfortunately it seems like nothing has really been improved. On the subject of problems that AC Origins had, let's talk combat. Assassin's Creed Odyssey's combat is unsatisfying and a pain in the ass to use. Is it hard? Not particularly, unless you're going up against overleveled enemies, but I found it barely ever felt like it was working properly. Enemies break out of combos with little warning, the dodge is unreliable at best, and sometimes, for no reason, your special abilities will just straight up miss. Even when it is functioning, the combat just doesn't feel good. Button mapping is super weird and you're unable to change it properly, enemies are damage sponges unless you overlevel yourself, and the core mechanics wear thin so quickly, thanks to their repetitive nature and the lack of variety with execution animations. Say what you will about old Assassin's Creeds being all about counterbaiting, but at least combat encounters were fast, satisfying, and I never got bored. Luckily, the game does shine in a few ways. Odyssey's stealth mechanics are nothing new, and the AI can occasionally be pretty goofy, but for the most part taking a sneaky approach to the game is usually the most enjoyable way to play, if only because then you don't have to deal with so much combat. Enemies aren't all instantly aware of your presence as soon as a single person spots you, and you're given enough of a grace period to dispatch enemies who have spotted you before they raise any alarms, so that's good. On top of that, like Origins before it, Odyssey is lacking the fast and fluid parkour of previous games in the series, but its current traversal system definitely works better in relation to stealthy infiltrations. It's just a shame that you have to dedicate so many in-game resources to your assassination abilities in particular to make the stealth approach worthwhile. To that point, Assassin's Creed Odyssey's approach to loot and leveling is interesting in that each piece of gear boosts your damage along one of 3 different types: Warrior for combat, Hunter for ranged, and Assassin for, well, assassinations. Your level up skills generally work off of these damage numbers too, so if you want to play the game in a certain way, you definitely have the ability to build your character along their path. That said, Assassin's Creed Odyssey will constantly try to lead you back into combat, whether that be through mandatory fights that you can't avoid, or simply by making assassination targets too tough to kill in a single strike. It's such a shame that Odyssey's subpar combat is so pervasive. It even manages to taint the parts of the game that I genuinely enjoyed a lot. Like the naval combat, for instance. There's more of it here than there was in Origins, but despite it working about as well as it did back in Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag, actually boarding a defeated ship is no longer fun because of how frustratingly poor the combat is. It made it so that whenever I could, I would avoid boarding an enemy ship entirely, choosing to ram it in half instead. Beyond the vast majority of Odyssey's gameplay, I think I'm most disappointed by the game's pacing. It's not usually something I have many issues with in any game, but AC Odyssey feels like it's all over the place. By having such a large open world that requires so much time to travel between main missions, and coupling that with a level locked difficulty that will require at least a little bit of grinding, progressing through the main story feels like an absolute slog. On top of that, the main story branches a few times, and it's never clear in which order these missions should be played. By the time I had hit one of the game's 3 endings, I was still a couple of hours off hitting the other 2, and the one I hit first seemed like the most significant, so the rest of AC Odyssey's ending was just a letdown. I can't think of another game that could have benefited so much from being just a tiny bit more linear. With all that said, Assassin's Creed Odyssey is mediocre. For a game that's so huge and that takes so much time to finish, it's a shame that there's so little value to sink your teeth into. The combat is unsatisfying, the leveling system throws the pacing and fun out of whack, and the stealth, which is good, is rarely ever rewarded thanks to the ineffective assassination ability. There's a lot of technical mastery to appreciate, of course, but so much of Assassin's Creed Odyssey just feels homogenized and hollow. If you liked Assassin's Creed Origins, this is more of the same, but really, I can't say I'd recommend it to anyone beyond fans of the last game.